Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in philosophy, especially the great classics, which are classics for good reason. From each, I've selected an excerpt, 20, 30, 40 minutes, no more than an hour, and we'll be doing an introduction to an important work, a close reading with the accompanying text. In this episode, we are turning to Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile's jointly written The Doctrine of Fascism. In this work, after Mussolini has assumed power, he joins forces with the Hegelian philosopher Gentile to express the philosophy and ideology of fascism. Let's go to the text. The Doctrine of Fascism is a co-authored work by Benito Mussolini, who had come to power as Prime Minister of Italy in 1922. And he's joining up with a well-regarded Hegelian professor of philosophy, Giovanni Gentile. They wrote this in 1927, 5 years after Mussolini came to power, and published it in 1932. Start with the text. Like all sound political conceptions, fascism is action and it is thought, action in which doctrine is immanent. And then we get some clearly Hegelian language about the kind of doctrine arising from a given system of historical forces in which it is inserted and working on them from within. It therefore has a form correlated to contingencies of time and space, but it also has an ideal content which makes it an expression of truth in the higher region of the history of thought. So it's a union of the contingent and the necessary, the day-to-day with the timeless set of principles. Later on in this introductory paragraph, they make clear that this is not just opportunistic politics or business as usual, but rather this is an ideologically driven movement, that they have ideals. Indeed, they have an entire philosophy of life that they are trying to bring about. There can be no conception of the state which is not fundamentally a conception of life, philosophy, or intuition. System of ideas evolving within the framework of logic or concentrated in a vision of faith, but always, at least potentially, an organic conception of the world. So it's an entire philosophy of life, an entire philosophy of the world. Politics on a day-to-day basis then is an instantiation of that. Now, what kind of philosophy are we talking about? And if we're familiar with the language, we will recognize the Hegelianism, and clearly Gentile is bringing his PhD philosopher Hegelian credentials to him. For most of his youth and well into his adult life, Mussolini had been a Marxist socialist, and so he knows the Marxist doctrine also well, which speaks, of course, of the historical forces working their way out, and Marxism owes a certain debt evolutionarily to Hegelian philosophy as well. So we can recognize the language, but in this case, it's clearly the Hegelianism that is going to dominate, and that's what we get in the next paragraph. Fascism is a spiritual attitude, and here they go on to reject metaphysical materialism, which they will dismiss as a kind of superficial philosophical outlook. Fascism sees the world not only in those superficial material aspects in which man appears as an individual, standing by himself, self-centered, subject to natural law, which instinctively urges him toward a life of selfish, momentary pleasure. So what we then have is an entire metaphysics that says individuals are real and individuals are fundamental, individuals are material beings, part of the material world, and that it is therefore materialistic or physicalistic instincts and gratifications that are the meaning of life. All of that fascism is going to reject and replace it with a kind of spiritualism. Instead, it sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, with common traditions and a mission, which, suppressing the instinct for life, interesting formulation, closed in a brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. So we have then a spiritualistic metaphysics contrasted to a materialistic metaphysics. We have the idea that the individual is not fundamentally real, but rather a kind of collectivism. It's the nation or the country across generations, all unified into a collective being that has its own developmental path. And we have an ethic. Life is not about ethically or morally pursuing self-interest, pursuing happiness, pursuing pleasure. Instead, the proper ethical attitude that fascism embodies is sacrifice, renunciation, and the development of the spiritual side of one's existence. And that is necessarily, in many cases, going to require renunciation and even a sacrifice of the material side of one's being. So already we have a metaphysics, we have a view of human nature, and we have a value framework that fascism is integrating. That is to say, we are well on the way to having a full philosophy. Now they emphasize that this is an ethical system, that they are putting this forward as ideals. We're not just brute power politics grubbing for whatever we can get. We believe that we have moral ideals. This positive conception of life is obviously an ethical one. Therefore, life, and then a further description of the nature of this ethical life, as conceived by the fascist, is serious. It's not about pleasure. It's austere. It's not about enjoying all of the good things of life. And religious. That is to say, it's not about materialistic, non-spiritual things. All its manifestations are poised in a world sustained by moral forces and subject to spiritual responsibilities. The fascist disdains an easy life. Now, this concept of religion emphasized again. So we're not materialists, so they're going to be against clearly those forms of socialism, for example, Marxism, that are explicitly atheistic, but they're also going to be opposed to any sort of more hedonistic or happiness in this life, and happiness defined in terms of the gratification and achievement of physical values conception of life. It's a religious, and they'll have some things further to say about the religion in particular. Man is viewed in his immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective will, not just a subjective will. And that objective will transcends the individual, raising him to a conscious membership of a spiritual society. Again, a view of human nature in a broader metaphysical context. So, 18th century materialism, rejection, any sort of individualism rejected. This also includes the more Jacobinistic variations, kind of Rousseau-inspired phase of the revolution, a certain kind of socialistic egalitarianism, which is again materialistic from this perspective. We are rejecting all of that. Life is not about happiness and even the possibility of happiness. This anti-individualistic theme is stressed repeatedly. It's not about you as an individual with your goals, values, dreams, your rights, and so forth. All of those elements are systematically rejected here. Anti-individualistic. The fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state, accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. So there will be some allowance of individuality, but only if that individuality is nested within, subordinate to, and in the service of the state. The state stands for the conscience. The conscience is one's moral beliefs, one's moral principles, one's ideals, and the universal will of man as a historic entity. It is opposed to classical liberalism, and a little bit later by name they will mention Adam Smith, but here we clearly have in mind that entire tradition from John Locke on through Adam Smith and on through to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. That entire classical liberal tradition is being rejected. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. So the argument for liberalism is that the individuals are real. Individuals are the unit of reality, the unit of value. The individual's freedom is fundamental, and states exist in a servant role. They serve the interests of the individuals as expressed in certain rights, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it is under liberalism, the liberty of the individual that is paramount. The state is in the service of that. Fascism is saying the exact opposite is true. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. So the claim here is enunciated in political form. That then is to say the individual as we typically see him is not the real unit. It said your essence as an individual is to be found in the state, that the state in some sense represents or embodies. We'll need to flesh that out a little bit more, but that's where you find your true self or your true individuality. It's the state as a collectivized individual that is the reality. All right, the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing, and here we have this introduction of the word totalitarian, which is a dirty word from the perspective of some other political perspectives, but is embraced as a positive ideal by the fascists. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, right? And the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values. It is the whole. It is everything. It exerts total control over all aspects of life. No individuals or groups outside the state. So it's not the idea that we have our lives as individuals, we form social groupings and association, and the state comes along as an afterthought or as an appendage or as a very limited functional role. Rather, it is the state that has the priority and everything is to be fitted within the state. There's a contrast then to socialism, and by socialism here he is thinking, they rather are thinking of the Marxist version of socialism, which had emphasized a class struggle. So Marxism, of course, was anti-individualistic. That version of socialism wants to say we are a collective entity, we should be all part of one collective, but they define that collective in terms of classes, and those classes are defined in terms of economics. And so what the fascists are saying is that economics is too narrow. The fascism that we have in mind is much more total. The economic is only going to be a portion of the overall organic unity that is the state. Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon. That is to say, trade unionism as used by the class analysis of Marxist socialism. But there is going to be a proper role for understanding the interests of the workers and an organization of the workers. Trade unions will be fine, but only, again, if that particular grouping and set of economic interest is nested within a broader, more total understanding of the state, the state's function. And here we have then an introduction of more medieval-sounding language or more feudal-sounding language, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system in which the divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized rather in the unity of the state. So rather than saying, as the Marxist socialists will doing, that ultimately human beings should be one class, all of us workers engaging in physical labor, having the same set of interests, and then organized into a collective unity on that basis, the fascists are going to argue that we're not individuals off doing our various things. We are organized into various kinds of social groupings. Some of them are religious groupings, some of them are family groupings, some of them are economic groupings, and other kinds of cultural groupings as well. And so all of those have their interests, and those interests organized and represented should be taken cognizance of. And so we could sort of see a society is built in a whole bunch of corporate bodies or a whole number of guilds, and the job of the state is to organize and coordinate and give precedence to some at the appropriate times. So, grouped according to their several interests, individuals form classes, they form trade unions when organized, but first and foremost they form the state. We're also then going to be against various forms of democracy. This is a very interesting paragraph on the nature of democracy, because democracy just means rule by the people or power by the people. But how do we figure out what the will of the people is going to be? Who counts as the people? And the most common form of democracy in modern times has been a majoritarian understanding of democracy. There's a whole bunch of individuals, and they have overlapping interests of various sorts. And the best that we can do is at any given time take the majority's opinion, and that's going to be the will of the people for that period of time until we have the next election. So fascism, however, is rejecting that form of democracy. Fascism is therefore opposed to that form of democracy which equates a nation to the majority. But then they go on to say there's a way in which you can see fascism as democratic. Right? It is the purest form of democracy if the nation be considered as it should be, from the point of view of quality rather than a quantity, as an idea, the mightiest because the most ethical, the most coherent, the truest, expressing itself in a people, the people as a whole, as the conscience and the will of the few, if not indeed of the one. So here we have a suggestion that the will of the people as a whole, as a collective entity, might very well be expressed by one individual, and we know who Mussolini has in mind as that one individual, or possibly it could be a few individuals through whom the will of the majority is made manifest. Now, what do we mean by this collective entity, this will of the whole? And they then introduce some distinctions and further rejections here. We mean one will, one conscience, and again, it is a spiritual being that we are talking about. It's going to be the Italian collectivity, for example. They go on then to say this is not a race. And why is it not a race? Well, race has, of course, different meanings in different contexts, but I think in this case, race is being used biologically. It's not a matter of a biological collectivity that we are talking about. Biological collectivities are too materialistic, too physicalistic, and fascism is emphasizing a more spiritual / religious understanding of what one's true collectivity is. Nor is it a geographically defined region. So we don't just draw lines on a map. Again, that is too physicalistic. It's not a matter of possession of certain and controlling water, air, and land. Again, that is too materialistic. It is a people historically perpetuating itself, unified by an idea. Right? So it's an idea that is the unification of the people. Imbued with the will to live, the will to power, likely some Nietzschean language being borrowed here, self-consciousness, personality. All right, carrying on. The state is not only authority which governs and confers legal form and spiritual value on individual wills, rather, it is a power which makes its will felt and respected beyond its own frontiers. tears. Okay, it is a power itself. It has its own will. All right, so again, we are going to be rejecting and making clear that we are rejecting any form of liberalism, the fascist state. Its functions cannot therefore be limited to those of enforcing order and keeping the peace, as the liberal doctrine had it. So the liberal doctrine, right, was the position we have individuals. Individuals have rights, the right to their own life, right to their own liberty, right to their own property, right to the pursuit of happiness. And the state is more like an adjudicator of disputes amongst individuals, or if some individuals violate the rights of others, it will take those and put those in prison or whatever it will do. And for the most part, though, the state's going to stay in the background. That is not the kind of state that we are talking about. It is no mere mechanical device for defining the sphere within the individual may duly exercise his supposed rights. Individuals on this conception do not have rights. Fascism, in short, is not only a lawgiver and a founder of institutions, but an educator and a promoter of spiritual life. It needs to get inside your spirit and to govern your spirit. And it is only through your being governed by the spirit as embodied in the state that, in fact, you realize on this conception your true self, your true individuality. To achieve this purpose, it enforces discipline and uses authority, entering into the soul and ruling with undisputed sway. Therefore, it has chosen as its emblem the lictor's rods, the symbol of unity, strength, and justice. And I'll insert here an illustration of the lictor's rods that were shown. Any given rod all by itself is bendable and can be broken, but if you take a number of rods, put them together, bind them with a strap, it becomes extraordinarily powerful and almost impossible to bend. In unity, there is strength, and we see also the axe. This is a weapon, and so there are implications for discipline, but also for war and foreign policy to come. All right, in this next section, it's in the first person, and so we know it's Mussolini speaking, and he mentions going back to 1915. It's interesting to reflect that World War I is going on in 1915, and that up until this point, Mussolini had been a Marxist socialist, kind of a true believer in that doctrine, active as a journalist, active in party politics and so forth. But when he breaks away from that and founds the Fascist Party in 1915, he says he didn't have at that point a well worked out doctrinal program. The only doctrine, he says, of which I had practical experience was that of socialism. But the problem had been that over the course of the last 10 years, and clearly by the time we get into World War I, in Mussolini's eyes, it seems that socialism is dead, and it's shortly dying rather, and is shortly going to be dead. And what he wants to say is that already by 1905, what had been a more unified, obviously there have been factions and different versions and so on, but after 1905, socialism had splintered into all sorts of groups. Even the Marxist groups were breaking up into all kinds of neo-Marxisms and so on. So the socialist candle is going out. And so by the time we get 4 years later, he goes on, the war ended, but 1919 rather, socialism, he thinks, is dead. And one of the important things that World War I had brought to Mussolini as a realization was this Marxist socialist idea that the right collective was the class, and that the right classes were economic classes, and that World War I was a battle of capitalist factions that were going to kill each other off, and that capitalism had been developing the class consciousness of the proletariat, and the workers were going to rise up and so forth. that all of that seemed to be exploded from Mussolini's perspective by what actually happened in World War I. Instead, the workers did not see themselves, the workers of Italy and the workers of France and Germany and Russia and so on, as members of a unified class. Instead, the collectives that they identified with were their nations, with their countries. Economic interests were of a lower order to them. And so Mussolini, in forming fascism, is wanting to retain that same collectivity of all of the socialisms, but to argue that the Marxists were wrong in making economics fundamental. Instead, it's got to be a much richer and more complicated understanding of what collectives the individual's identity is to be found in. Now, his moving away from Marxist socialism, he wants to make clear, does not mean that we are going over to the bourgeoisie, using some of that Marxist language. Quote, if the bourgeoisie, I then said, believe that they have found in us their lightning conductors, they are mistaken. Right? The bourgeoisie are just going to be one other group within the overall Italian state. We must go towards the people, and by the people he means the broad mass of the population. Of the people, we wish the working classes to accustom themselves to the responsibilities of management so that they may realize it is no easy matter to run a business. So rather than this antagonism between the owners of capital and the laborers of capitalism, what Mussolini is suggesting, that we want to break that down. We are all part of a broader collectivity. We should be working together, and one way to do that is to raise the consciousness, so to speak, of the workers by giving them management control, and then they will realize that much of that antagonism was based on a simple lack of understanding of what the other side was contributing to the overall economic process. We're also, again, not going to be representational democracies. The existing forms of political representation cannot satisfy us. Instead, we are going to have direct representation of the several interests. It may be objected that this program implies a return to the guilds, to the corporation. It doesn't matter. Yes, we're fine with using the guild language and the corporation language. And some of people are going to say, oh, you just wanted us to go back to the Middle Ages, to old feudal guilds. And they're going to say, no, we're not going to be going back. Instead, we are going to say they had something right, this guild organization, but it's going to be put on a much more new and modern formulation. It's going to be a future-looking, not a backward-looking movement. All right, fascism, he points out during this time in the early stages, was not about the easy life, the pursuit of pleasure and materialistic values. One of the things he prizes as an ethical value is their willingness to die. There were discussions, but there was something more sacred and more important to the fascists: death. Fascists knew how to die. At this stage, they didn't have a well-worked-out doctrine about what this new fascist ideology was going to be, but nonetheless, they were committed to one of its core values, a willingness to die for the collective cause. All right, another provocative paragraph where Mussolini and Gentile make it clear that they're not at all interested in peace. In fact, they are embracing war. One of their criticisms of liberalism, of classical liberalism, of capitalism, is that it seems to be a more pacific motion. The idea of the capitalist peace, businesses and people in different countries trading with each other. And so, there I am in my country, I'm manufacturing stuff, but I'm importing all of my raw materials from some other country. Well, I don't want to go to war with that country because it's going to cut into my profits. As soon as the war starts, I'm not going to be able to get my raw materials. Or now that I'm an international capitalist order that we've been developing, I'm manufacturing all of my goods and I'm selling them to people in all of these other countries. Well, I don't want to go to war with those other countries over there because then I'm losing all of those potential customers. So the capitalist movement and the liberalist movement, that we should respect people's rights of self-determination and not override them by force. Mussolini and Gentile are arguing that they do not favor peace, and particularly that conception of peace as a value. Fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or the utility of perpetual peace. Now, the possibility part first. If you have any number of different countries and different nations, each with its own spirit, its own will, its own collection of interests, its own histories, necessarily part of that is going to involve conflict with other nations. That's a big part of the history that has defined each of the nations that have been involved. And then also nations are going to have different wills and different identities and different values that they are striving for, and that's going to put them in conflict with each other. And so from their perspective, it's impossible to get away from war and conflict as the future reality necessarily for human beings. But also, peace is not very useful. And then they go on to explain why they don't think peace is useful. It discards pacifism as a cloak for cowardly supine renunciation in contradistinction to self-sacrifice. Oh, I don't want to go to war. I might get killed. Well, what a coward you are! A real man, a moral person, wants to and is willing to sacrifice for his country. But even further, they go on to argue war alone keys up all human energies to their maximum tension and sets the seal of nobility on those people who have the courage to face it. So war brings people together and gives them a consciousness of being a people together and energizes them to work together for a common goal. Equally foreign to the spirit of fascism, even if accepted as a useful meaning in special circumstances, are all internationalistic or league superstructures, which, as history shows, crumble to the ground whenever the heart of nations is deeply stirred. So people are first and foremost members of national groups, and only derivatively and temporarily are they going to enter into various sorts of international agreements. So the idea that we can, as the liberals would like, to have an international league of nations with free trade everywhere and the elimination of tariffs and the free movement of money and capital goods and immigration and so on, to have an international liberal order, the fascists are rejecting that. And of course, they are rejecting that internationalistic understanding of a future order that the communists were striving for. The idea that the workers of the world, all of the nations, have the same economic interests, and then ultimately, under communism, which will become a worldwide revolution, we will have kind of an international working class coming together and mounting a revolution and the new type of society. So we're rejecting both the liberal and the Marxist understandings of international. We are nationalistic if we are fascist. Finally, we're going to reject, once again, democracy in that specific kind of 19th and early 20th century form that has been most prevalent. Fascism trains its guns on the whole block of democratic ideologies and rejects both their premises and their practical applications. For elections, nope. It denies the right of numbers to govern by means of periodic consultation. So we're not going to put ourselves out there in the form of a vote every period of 4 years or whatever. It asserts the irremediable and fertile and beneficent inequality of men. So not everybody is fit to govern. Not everybody is expressing the universal will in various ways. So we shouldn't pretend that that is true and give everybody the vote. So it's not the physical individual with his or her unique individual opinions. That's not what we are talking about. It is the universal human that may happen to be in each individual, but it's that universal human that needs to be connected by those in a position to understand what that universal connection is. All right, reason and science, and an interesting cognitive or epistemological point that had been put here. One of the reasons why the fascists are rejecting classical liberalism and capitalism and so forth is that those doctrines were based on a certain understanding of reason, that individuals are rational enough to be able to govern their own economic affairs, to negotiate on their own behalf, to sign contracts, and so on. That individuals are rational enough to be able to deliberate on political matters, to enter in discussions and debates and weigh all of these major issues of the time, and then to cast an informed vote in the elections. And so any sort of democratic capitalism depends then on a certain understanding of reason being powerful and widespread, and that each individual has the capacity for a dignified self-governance. We are rejecting that view if we are fascists. Reason and science, and here they are quoting Renan, an earlier thinker. Reason and science are the products of mankind, but it's chimerical to seek reason directly for the people and through the people. The vast majority of people don't have that kind of reason. It is not essential to the existence of reason that all should be familiar with it. And even if all had to be initiated, this could not be achieved through democracy, etc., etc. So again, we're not going to presuppose that reason and sensible political judgment is widely distributed in the population, and so giving them direct power or even consulting them, that's just wrong. Okay. So instead, what we are in favor of is that different kind of democracy where it's a spiritual collective that is the people. The writer of these pages has already defined fascism as an organized, centralized, authoritarian democracy. Another criticism of the liberal century, by which they mean the 1800s going on into the early 1900s, they're going to argue the system was just full of contradictions and inefficiencies, so it piled up various Gordian knots, and that is the cause for World War I. So from the fascist perspective, World War I was a manifestation of the pathologies of that liberal capitalist century that had been experimented with in the previous century. Never has any religion claimed so cruel a sacrifice. That is to say, World War I is put at the doorsteps of the liberals. And then he goes on to say, well, this is why all of the political experiments of our day are anti-liberal. So as we get into the 1920s, it's very hard to find any liberals anymore, any capitalists in the ideological sense anymore. Everybody is in favor of some sort of fascism. So the National Socialists are on the rise in Germany. There's been the communist revolution in Russia already by 1932. There's been the Great Depression in the United States and the beginnings of the New Deal. And so everybody is basically saying liberalism is done, capitalism is done. Instead, what we need is to have some sort of centralized, organized, more authoritarian type of political regime. And it's only a competition then among several of the major contenders there. So we need to be totalitarian, that is repeated here again. At the same time, we are not going to be absolutist in the same sense that we are going to say there's one set of principles that are always going to be applied practically in the same way. And what we find in this next long paragraph is the fascists introducing a certain amount of pragmatism. So it's not the case that these ideals, what works at one time, it might be the same general ideals, but the way that they work out in this era is going to be the same as the way they work out in the next era. The principles themselves in their application and manifestation are going to need to evolve, and here the fascists are then incorporating some philosophical pragmatism as it had been developed by Peirce, Dewey, and some of the other major pragmatic thinkers here. So it rejects the idea of a doctrine suited to all times and to all people. And down toward the bottom, hence the pragmatic strain in fascism, its will to power, its will to live its attitude towards violence and its value. Power will be manifested in this way, violence will be manifested in that way, and it will be adaptable and flexible to the circumstances, although guided by the same general principle. In the middle of this paragraph, there's a very interesting formulation that's worth dwelling upon for a few moments. We're rejecting classical liberalism, we're rejecting socialism of the Marxist variety, we're rejecting democratic doctrines as well. Then they go to introduce a kind of political spectrum claim that's quite interesting. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right. And in the original Italian, it is the word the right. A fascist century. So from their perspective, they are putting fascism on the right of the spectrum. In the next sentence, though, they say, if the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism, we are free to believe that this is the collective century, and therefore the century of the state. So what we then have is, if fascism is on the right, and that's the movement that's going to come to prominence in the 20th century, they're arguing, and it involves a rejection of the doctrine of the 19th century, and that was liberalism and individualism, then the claim that Mussolini and Gentile are making is that kind of classic liberal capitalism is on the left. And so the dichotomy, or at least the spectrum which we can dichotomize, is such that it's liberal individualism on the left and fascism is on the right. This is the doctrine that we tried and failed in the 19th century, the doctrine on the left, and then fascism on the right is going to be the replacement of it. As we all know, discussions of the proper structure and labeling of the political spectrum is extraordinarily hotly argued, so this is the fascist contribution to that debate. All right, reiteration that we are speaking of a kind of absolutism, a kind of totalitarianism, but they are making no bones about this. This is not just because we like power and we like to control people. The claim is that this is in the service of the highest ethical ideals. The collectivism embodied in the state, the suppression of the individual or the service of the individual, the renunciation of physical pleasures, willing to sacrifice for the higher cause as embodied in the state. Okay, that point is repeated again. It's repeated again, showing that they've done their homework. They go after the liberals once again. So it's not just a cartoon version of liberalism from their perspective. We've read our Jeremy Bentham, the Englishman. We've read von Humboldt, the German. We've read Adam Smith, the Scot. All of those guys were dominant in the 19th century. We have moved past them. And what is interesting, they want to say, is that even the capitalists have abandoned capitalism. That is to say, the people who are the leaders of the major businesses. So they are capitalists in the sense that they are in control of capital and making decisions and managing capital and so on. But he's arguing that even they are no longer capitalists in the ideological sense. That is to say, they don't believe in absolute private property and free trade and so forth. Instead, what they are all doing, the claim here is clamoring for government intervention and government favors and subsidies and tariff protection and so on. What would they say now to the unceasing, inevitable, and urgently requested interventions of government in business? So the business capitalists have abandoned liberal capitalism and are just one more pressure group lining up for favors from the state, just like all of the other pressure groups that are making up society. If liberalism spells individualism, fascism spells government. So liberalism, small or limited government; fascism, large and total government. It's not to say that we're going to totally deny the individual. The fascist state organizes the nation, but it leaves the individual adequate elbow room. It has curtailed useless or harmful liberties while preserving those which are essential. So lots of liberties are taken away, but those are not liberties that are good for you or good for the individual anyway. And of course, who makes those decisions about what the right liberties to have and not have are? Well, it can't be left up to the individual. The state. It matters not, in such matters, rather, the individual cannot be the judge, but the state only. Matters religious, another important element here. The fascist state is not indifferent to religious phenomenon. It sees Roman Catholicism as the special positive religion of the Italians. Now, in keeping with their pragmatism, the suggestion is going to be that generic fascism in different nations with different religious traditions the fascist state in those nations will not necessarily be Roman Catholic. They will be whatever the religion of that other country. That's the sort of thing on which it will be flexible, but it will be religious, right? Religion is another kind of collective spiritual bringing together of human beings. And so as long as religion is seen as in the service of the state, everything is fine. So this is an interesting break, and one of the reasons why the fascists are rejecting materialism. In the Marxist form of materialism, Marxism was more militantly atheistic, right, seeing religion as the opium of the people, and we needed to get people off the drugs, and so the Marxists actively suppress religion. The fascists are more spiritual, and they are seeing religion as an essential tool for the management of human beings' spiritual life. It is also that fascism is not opposed to imperialism. So it's not even the idea that we will have our fascist state here and maybe you'll have your fascist state over there. Necessarily, there's the expansion or shrinking of various sorts of nations that they're taking over. Conquering new territory, expanding one's society is a sign of life and vitality. So fascism sees in the imperialist spirit, i.e. in the tendencies of nations to expand, a manifestation of their vitality. So once again, we're not interested in peace. Peace is just giving up and shrinking and basically saying to the other nations that are still powerful, come and take us over. All right. Re-emphasizing the ethical principles, imperialism implies discipline, the coordination of efforts, a deep sense of duty, and a spirit of sacrifice. No individual freedom, no individual pursuit of happiness, no egoistic self-realization ethic. Instead, it is the exact opposite here. And then ending on a what they hope to be a high note, that it's not just them, a few individuals announcing this fascist doctrine, but rather they are arguing that this is what the people want. They've tried liberalism. Everybody can see that socialism is a disaster. Fascism is the only alternative. Never before have the peoples thirsted for authority, direction, order as they do now. Hence, the claim is, our age is the fascist age.